Hello everyone, welcome to the video for chapter 11. So today we're going to be talking about the evolution itself, and so we're going to learn what does it mean by evolution, and in context of biology, of course, and then we learn how do we know that evolution actually occurred. So what are the evidences for the evolution? So let's begin by talking about the evolution itself. So what is evolution? Evolution is basically the change that happens over a longer period of time that helps us or the organisms to better adapt to their environment. Now, it's very important to realize that evolution is going to happen over multiple generations. So it's not that evolution can just occur on the individual basis. It actually happens over the multiple generations in a population. So a population evolves and the individual does not dissolve. You want to make sure that you understand this part very well. Once you are born in your lifetime, you're not evolving. On the other hand, if you pass on, the evolution is passed on over the multiple generations. So you have to reproduce and then create more generations, and that's where the new generations may have the characteristic which they inherited, which better suits them for their environment, and that helps them adapt to the environment, and we're going to call that evolution. Okay, so it does not happen at the individual level. So once you're born, you do not evolve. Okay, so biologically, of course. And then what do we mean actually by the population? So a group of individuals that of the same species which is living in a defined area. So for example, that you have a forest which is separated from another forest, let's say by a long river, and one organism, a population is living in one zone of the forest, and then the another population will be in another zone of the forest across the river. So yes, those can be called two different populations. Okay. Now, if we actually again want to see with these images what evolution is, you guys can actually notice that at the very bottom you guys see that we have this individual for which the fossil was found a long time ago. We can talk more about this this species right here. We're going to talk in more detail later on. But as you guys can see on the very top, you guys are actually looking at the current whale, what the whale actually looks like, and then it's shown that how a whale has actually evolved from this organism. Actually, it's showing you here that there's actually a common ancestor that was found here. So you're going to be seeing these structures, these trees very often from today as we talk about evolution. So what this is showing us is that there was a common ancestor right here, which actually gave rise to all these different species over time. And then we can see that how this might have evolved from this ancestor, and we can find the similarities between these from the fossils that were found by some people. So again, we'll go back to this image later on and talk in more detail. So so now evolution. How does evolution occur? How does it happen? A very important concept here of natural selection. We want to understand what natural selection means. So guys, natural selection is the process where the individuals are getting selected because of the environment that they live in. For instance, you can see that these two birds with two different sizes of beak, one with the small size and one with the bigger size. Maybe one of these is the smaller one is going to have advantage, or the bigger one is going to have the advantage based on what they're trying to eat. So the evolution is seen, for example, in this case, that the larger, so the birds with the larger beaks were able to eat the food that was available, and that's why only these birds with the longer beak were actually able to survive more and reproduce more, and was more dominating than in a population. So you can see how a population has evolved. okay, over time. Now, something very similar happened here as well with this example of moth. This is a very common example in biology and also in general whenever we talk about evolution, where you can see that we have two different types of these moths. One is this, which is completely dark and actually blends in with this tree, and this tree is actually affected by the soot. That's why we are saying it's a soot darkened tree on which you have this moth and then you have this moth. Imagine you have these two moths and then you're a bird and you're trying to look to eat one of these moths. Which one do you think you're going to pick? Which one are the one which you're going to pick? You're going to pick this one because this one is so much easily visible versus this one. So do you see how this moth has an advantage over this moth on the left hand side? Because this dark moth actually blends in with the dark tree, and because of that, so this happened during the population, which is during the London smog, when the trees, because of high pollution, there was soot deposited on these trees. So both of these two varieties of moth already existed. So first of all, we want to understand that that the evolution or the adaptation or this natural selection thing does not happen by wish, or so it happened just by chance. So it was not by design. It was not that this moth was just prepared that this pollution suit thing is going to happen, and then I'm going to turn black, and then because of that I will not be visible to the birds, and I will survive. That's not how it works. Just by a chance, you already had both of these species already existing, both of these varieties already existing. We're going to talk more about this in our next video when we actually talk about the mechanism of evolution, how variety actually exists. So you can see how this has advantage over this one on the left. So this one is going to survive more, and then this was seen that over a period of time, within the human generation, within 2 human generations, we were able to see how much more of these black moths we have because they survive more. They were able to reproduce more. Now, if you go back to the time when the trees were not affected by soot, you can see how the peppered moth actually had the advantage over the black moth. So it's not that it was by design. Both of these existed earlier. This one, the pepper one, had the advantage, but now the black one, the darker one, had the advantage over the peppered one when the trees were covered by the soot. So I hope it makes sense that how natural selection occurs. So natural selection is not by design, just by chance. Both the versions existed. One of them just was able to succeed more when it comes in terms to survival and reproduction. And you can see how then evolution happened, and now we have more of these in our population for the moth. So I hope natural selection here makes sense. Now let's go further and talk about how selection can be natural as well as artificial, especially when it comes to us human beings, how we have figured out the artificial selection for our benefit, how we do selective breeding, for example, for these for this, if you see this wolf, how we have domesticated, how we have how we bred a different wolf, maybe with different dogs, and then how you have developed more domesticated versions of these dogs. So this is again evolution, but not by natural selection, but we by doing a selective breeding, which is now causing artificial selection to happen. So artificial selection or natural selection, both are evolution, but artificial is the one which is actually done by humans by performing selective breeding. Natural selection, on the other hand, the variety exists for a given species, but then because of the advantageous characteristic that one species has, or one trait has of one species in an environment, and it survives better and reproduces better, and that's why it's able to succeed, and that's how natural selection happens, and they evolve. Now, there are few evidences, there are few categories of evidence. I mean, there are so many evidences for evolution, but we have broadly categorized them into these 6 different types. Or if you actually want to see, the big ones are, so the first one I would like to mention here is the structural evidence that we have. So when you're going to talk about our next slide, when you're going to talk about the homologous structures, that is structural evidence that we have that evolution did happen. And then we have more examples. We're going to have 3 broad categories, and then we have the microbiology evidences, which we're going to talk under the DNA or the genetics. And then we have the third category, which is the direct evidence. Okay, direct evidence that we can actually see happening live in front of us, especially if you have worked in labs, or even in general, we understand how the flu virus can actually evolve over a given period of time. In our lifetime, we can actually see how every year we need a new flu shot to get ourselves resistant to a flu. So 3 broad categories, and under structural evidences, we're going to talk about the homologous structures. Okay, so let me get to that. So I'll get back to the fossil evidence is also one of the evidences, but I'm going to come back to this. First, I want to talk about the homologous structures. Sorry about this, guys, for this confusion. So I'm going to start the homologous traits first. So what are homologous structures or homologous traits? So as you guys can see that we have the human limb here, we have the whale limb, we have the bat limb, and let me show you on the next slide as well. Do you see how similar these structures look? If you look at these digits, you look at these structures, how similar. The ones that are color-coded are basically the same bones. And you can see how in human, dog, bird, and whale, how similar these structures are, and they might have different function. So homologous structures are the ones which have a different function. Like, for example, humans are going to use their hands to grab something, to hold something. Dogs are going to use them to walk. Birds are going to use them to fly. And then the whales are going to be using these their limbs as to swim. So you can see how we have different functions, but how similar these structures are. These structures are called homologous structures. So this is evidence. This is telling us that there must be a common ancestor, which from where we actually started. All of us started, and from here we had all these different individuals or organisms that have evolved over the period of time. I'm not saying that we're all coming from ancestor, but at the end there must be a common ancestor. Back many years ago, there must be ancestor which actually gave that from where we evolved, basically. Okay. All right. Now, if I go back to more evidences, then let's go back to the fossils. So fossils, guys, is also an evidence which again proves that evolution did happen, just like homologous structures was telling us that we came from a common ancestor, and then that ancestor evolved into a species, and then that evolved into different species. So we can actually also use the fossils to prove that evolution did happen. As you can see here, we have different types of soft body animal fossil. It tells you it lived 600 million years ago. And then this is another fossil from 400 to 350 million years ago. And then we have this fossil leaf 300 million years ago. And look at this beautiful fossil. This is 20 million years old for termite, which was actually preserved in ember. So imagine how happy this person would be who actually found this fossil for the first time. Where you can see these fossils, those are great as well. But look at this one. This one, the whole animal has been preserved. And now you can see what that termite looked like 20 million years ago, and that also indicates on how today's termite looked like, and we can actually go back and track how that evolution might have occurred, right? And then see this beautiful fossil where you have one organism entangled with another organism, so you can see how they got locked down, and then but the whole skeleton was actually preserved just like that. You can look at this one here where you can actually see the tree inside, and outside you can see the rock-like structure, and we call this a petrified wood. and this is all. So you can see how we can go back and look at that tree, which actually existed so many million years ago. So these are just examples of fossils. So these are the mineralized remains, as you can read here, or impressions of the organisms that lived on this earth millions of years ago. So this is like a photographic evidence that we have for millions of years ago. That's how important the fossils are, because they're, again, an evidence which is proving that evolution did happen. So also, I want to stress on this word here, transitional fossils. You want to be aware of this word, what that means. So evidence of species with some similarities to their ancestral groups. You can see a land-living animal. We're going to see this example later on. How a land-living mammal, which was the ancestor, and how it is similar to the descendant species, which is whales. So we're going to go back to that image that I showed you in the beginning, where we're going to look at how similar whales are to the ancestral group, which were land-living mammals, and the descendant species, which is whale, is actually now inside. It's not land-living, but it's actually sea-living, water-living mammal. And then another important thing here is that the edges of the fossil can actually be told, because it corresponds to the depth from where they have been found under the earth. So the older the fossil is going to be, you're going to find it deeper in the older rock layer. So if you're going to see that there's that we actually have rocks like structures, and then at the very bottom layer, that's where you're going to find the oldest fossil. And if you find a fossil right here, that's telling you this is a newer fossil coming from an organism which existed maybe a few million years back, but not versus here, which is this one maybe 100 million years ago, this one maybe 10 million years ago. So where you find it under the earth is going to decide how old that fossil is. So let's again look at this example here, which I showed you on the first slide, where you have your whale, and then you have this Indoyus. This is that land living organism which probably existed 47 million years ago or 50 million years ago. And if you actually look at this blue shade image, this is showing you how big the whale is on scale today. So all this has been drawn on scale, and you can see how small this one is. So they might, so the size difference you can see is pretty big. So if you see here, you can see how there have been small changes. Especially look at the limbs. You see how this was a land animal who could walk on the land, and then you can see the limbs are getting shorter and shorter, and see how much this one actually looks like crocodile. And then you keep going further, and you see the limbs are going away, and then you have these whales which all still have the limb, you can see, but it's not being used to walk, but instead to swim. So this again, all of these things are indicating that organisms were the one we see today. They were not like this from day one when they actually came to existence, but they actually evolved from similar looking species. Okay, and then when we later talk about more evidences, we'll see how maybe everything that you see, all the cells that you actually see on this planet actually came from single ancestor. Okay, because that's how when later we talk about DNA, you're going to see how that works out. Okay. So more examples here is for that same fossil for the Indoyus, where you can see how similar their teeth are with the hippopotamus. You can compare their molars, how their crushing molars are so much similar to what today's hippo has. So again, that's indicating that there must be that there are similarities, so they must have come from a common ancestor. Okay, some more adaptive traits. So these are the features that give an individual an improved function so that they survive better in an environment. And then, for instance, you see this example here. You see this is the extinct water-dwelling whale ancestor. And look on the right-hand side. This is bottom right. Here you have the rat, which is a land-dwelling mammal. So this, what you're seeing, is actually the bone structure. So you can see how hollow the bone is for the rat, which is a land-living mammal, which should actually have hollow bones. Why? Because they're going to be lighter, so it's going to be easy for a rat to run around because of that less dense, less heavy bones. On the other hand, if you go to an organism which was living in sea or in water, you see how they actually need heavy bones so that the ones who are trying to actually get into the so imagine there's an animal who is trying to go from land and jumping into the water and wants to almost run on water. They must not be able to. They should not be floating on the water. If they're floating on the water, they might. So if they go under shallow water, okay. So the example here is for the shallow water. So if you have shallow water where you cannot swim, you want to be able to run on there. So if you want to be able to run, you should be heavy. How are you going to be heavy? Your bone density. Your bones should be more dense. So you can see if there's a mammal who wants to able to survive in water and should be able to basically dive quickly in water, then that organism must have heavy bones, and you can see that did happen here. So this is just an example of an adaptive feature that the individual have, and how they can make them suit better into their environment to compete, to live better, to live more, and then to reproduce more. Okay. Now this is also another example where you can see this trait that there is in this insect, where it actually looks like it's sitting, that it is not an insect, but actually looks like as if it's just a part of a branch of tree, and then this can avoid detection by the predators. So again, evolution happened for this by natural selection. Not that this insect wanted to have this trait, and by design it had this trait and then was able to survive. That's not the case. Natural selection is not by design, but just by chance. So this insect happened to be this way, and because of that, it had a better chance to survive and reproduce, and that's why we have more of this insect than another insect, which would have been detected by a predator and died, and that's what was not able to reproduce. So you can see how this one has a competitive edge towards other insects. Okay, I hope that makes sense here. So then there's just terminologies on what ancestor means. Ancestor, of course, is the one from where the individuals must have evolved, and then the descent are the ones which are surviving today. The ones which we can see are actually, so common descents are the so if I go back to the slide where we had all these individuals here, so this was the common ancestor right here, and then all of these are the descents of this common ancestor. An example, and if we're talking about this ancestor, the one that survived here, then all of these here are descent of that ancestor. All right, I hope that makes sense. Okay, now I already talked about this slide. I talked about the homologous structures already. Let's also talk about the vestigial traits, what these means, and how this is supporting the evolution. So you can see how you are seeing an image for the snake here. You can see how snakes have these tiny limbs, and then what this is indicating is maybe. So first of all, vestigial traits are the one that the organisms still have today, but they're not useful feature, but they still exist because it does not hurt that animal. So over the time, because there was no use of them, they have been degenerated or have been reduced, and there's no function for them today. Same is true for this example that you see here. Same is true for appendix that we have in humans, where it does not have a role today, but probably had a role in our ancestors. So what you see here is again showing you that maybe the snakes have evolved from lizards. Like you see, lizards have long limbs, and they actually use them to walk. But on the other hand, for snakes, you don't need those limbs to walk, but instead they still have them, but they're much more reduced. But this at least is showing us that if they have this limb-like structure, you can see that in the skeletal structure, even though actually it might not be visible that much, but it actually is showing us that might have evolved from lizards, because lizards do have these legs, and over the period of time, snakes probably lost them, and they still have this leftover degenerated part here. So now, what we can talk about next is also for today, for these days, after we figured out stuff about the DNA. Once we start sequencing the DNA, now we have the sequence for DNA for all different species, and we can actually compare the DNA nucleotide by nucleotide. This for today is actually a very supportive evidence that evolution did happen. So as you can see here, that first of all the living organisms are using a DNA as their genetic material. That itself is an evidence that we must have evolved from an ancestor, which had genetic material, and then all the organisms that evolved from there also have this genetic material, which is the DNA. And then later on, as we see that there is actually, when we do the sequencing, so you can see this is a human DNA and this is a chicken DNA, and you can see how similar the DNA is. You can see when it's all blue, you're saying that it's all similar. Wherever it's highlighted with this yellow color, it's indicating those are the sequences that have changed in the DNA. So you can see in human and chicken, it's showing us for the insulin that out of that we have a 72% similarity or match between the human sequence and the chicken sequence. If you go next and you look at the human and mouse, you have 83% sequence similarity. And then if you look at the human and chimpanzee, which are actually considered to be very close in the evolution. And why is that? Why are we saying that they're close? Is because you see the genetic similarity, 98.4%. So if I give you these numbers on the exam and ask you which one is the most similar to human, you're going to say it's the chimpanzee. Why? Because their genes are so much similar. Their sequence is word by word is the same, except you see the small location here. This is where it changed. So we're just showing you, of course, a small segment of the gene, but you can tell if you can compare these three organisms here with human, you can see chimpanzee is the most similar one, and we can say that because of the genetic similarity. So this is again an evidence that we have something common between different organisms. Now, not just organisms that we actually think are like animals, like us, but even if you think of yeast, with yeast we have a 25% similarity, sequence similarity. And what is that telling us? That's also telling us even though yeast and us, there's like no comparison in how complex we are versus yeast, which is unicellular. We are multicellular, and you can tell how different we are. But at the genetic level, you see at the sequence level, we're 25% similar, and that's again a very strong evidence that we must have evolved from a common ancestor, and evolution did happen. Okay. So again, you want to see questions like these, which are again on these slides. If you're going to check your slides you download from Canvas, make sure you're reading these questions. They're going to help you with your quiz questions and your exams questions as well. Okay. So here the question is: if you found out a species which has a 96% similarity, will you say that it's more or less similar to humans versus chimpanzee? So human and chimpanzee, if you remember, has 98.4% similarity. So if you found an organism which has 96% similarity with humans, are you going to say this organism, this species with 96% is more similar, or chimpanzee and humans are more closely related? Of course, you can see 98.4% is more than 96%, which is indicating that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related versus humans and this species right here. Okay. All right. So let's go further. Let's look at more things that we want to discuss here, more evidences. So biogeography, how that is also an evidence that evolution must have happened. So today we can actually see, we're going to see on the next slide, that how this lungfish, which is only found in the northeastern Australia, how the fossils for that are actually found all over in different continents. So let's look at this image right here. You look at this Pangea, which is all the continents were all together 200 million years ago. But over time, this is how our continents look like today. This is how your world map should look like today. But of course, 200 million years ago, our continents were not far away like this, but they're actually together. So this fish we were talking about on the last slide can only be found in this region in Australia. But then the fossils, the red dots are showing you the where the fossils for this species has been found, and they've been found all over in different continents. What is this telling us? This is telling us that this species must have evolved or existed when we had all our planets, all our continents together as Pangea, and this is saying that, okay, see, if this evolution for the species occurred after Pangea, then you will not be able to find all the fossils in different locations. You'll only find it in this location. But since we do find fossils for this organism, for the species in different locations, this is telling us that so the evolution for this actually happened when all the continents were together. So this is not just telling us that evolution happened, but this is actually telling us that when did the evolution must have happened, before Pangea or after Pangea. Okay, and I expect a question on this on your exam as well. Okay, now another evidence, another homologous structure evidence. Homologous. So the homologous is again anything that is going to prove that we have similarities from a common ancestor. Those are homologous traits. And if we actually look at the embryonic development, we're going to see that in the next image, that how organism develops in a zygote until the full birth. You're going to see how similar the embryos for different organisms actually look like. So you look at the structure here. Look at this image. You have fish, reptile, bird, and humans. You see how similar the embryos look like, especially look at the gill slits and the tail. You look at the blue region, these are the gills. You can see how common they are in all different embryos for all these different organisms. And look at this tail here for fish, reptiles, birds, and humans, although we don't have tails anymore. But still, during the embryo is developing, we can actually see that we actually do see that tail forming. But later on, of course, it's going to not differentiate into a tail, and we're not going to see a tail. But you can see how in the embryo development is in itself a proof and evidence that evolution did happen. Okay. All right. So here we have more example for the embryo development. You can see for a dolphin how they have. This is the forelimb, the green one. And then this purple one, this one right here, that is the hind limb. And you can see how dolphins don't have hind limb when they are born, but they do have the forelimb. But you can see how forelimb was developing during the embryonic development, but then hind limb started, but then it stopped, and then it did not develop into a proper limb or flipper. Okay, so again, this is all proving that that they had hind limbs as well. Their ancestors had hind limbs as well, but not anymore. But we can still see it in the embryo. But when the actually embryo develops into a born dolphin baby, then they don't have those limbs anymore. They're just so small that you can't see them. Okay. Now, that's the end for this chapter right here, guys. Now I'm going to make another video for which you're going to find, you can talk about the mechanism of the evolution itself. Let me quickly go back to the slide that I was showing you earlier, where I was talking about the structural evidences. Okay, so under structural evidences, we have the homologous structures, we have the embryo development. The microbial genetics is where you actually see how similar or different the DNA is, and that how we can tell that evolution happened and how closely related one species is to another. And then, guys, we have the direct evidence. So direct evidence is the one where I mentioned in the beginning that we can actually tell that how quickly the bacteria or viruses actually evolve, because their reproduction time, or going from one generation to another generation time, is so small. You can given a favorable condition for bacteria will double in 20 minutes. So if you have one bacteria, it's going to divide into two. So reproduction has happened in bacteria within 20 minutes. On the other hand, for individuals like us, for animals like us, it could take years or at least 9 months for a baby to be born. and that also we have a window, like humans have a window for their reproductive cycle, where in the age period, let's say from when you hit puberty till the age of 45, 50 in women, that's the only time period when you can actually produce. So what is this? The point that I'm trying to make is that we can actually see evolution happening in front of us when we talk about bacteria and viruses. So, for instance, you might have noticed that doctors have been told, or doctors actually should not be prescribing antibiotics very leniently, meaning that they're going to tell you to avoid antibiotics, because what you're doing is with the antibiotic, so when you take an antibiotic, it's going to kill the bacteria in your gut, or if you've been infected with bacteria, it's going to kill that. But imagine there's one bacteria sitting inside which is actually resistant to that bacteria, and then that bacteria will be able to survive and become a superbug which is resistant to that antibiotic. And you see how it's going to have a competitive edge towards other organisms. And you see how natural selection happened there. So when you eat antibiotic, if you have 10 different bacteria in your gut, and then one already has resistance to that antibiotic for some reason, because of how it has resistance, because it's able to make some proteins in it, which is able to combat with that antibiotic, but the other 9 bacteria cannot. You see how the variation already existed, how you already had 10 bacteria, but one of them had the competitive edge, and that's why that one was able to survive, whereas the other ones were not able to survive and not able to reproduce. So this is again an evidence of how one individual, one species, one bacteria which had one population of bacteria which had that resistance was able to survive, and how this will then be able to evolve or be able to reproduce. So also with the example for the flu guys, when you see how every year we have to take a new flu shot, because when you take a flu shot this year, then within 1 year or within some time, the virus itself is able to evolve, and it evolves so much that that same flu shot that you took this year is not going to be good enough to combat that virus, and so now you have a virus which is resistant to your immune system. So now you need another flu shot, a new one, which is now more upgraded one, the one which can now fight with the new version of the virus we have. You see how there was a new version, which is now how one new version of the virus, which is causing flu, is becoming more dominant from years to years, and how we will then need some different resistance, and we're going to take a different flu shot every year. This is itself a proof, an evidence, direct evidence that evolution is actually happening in front of us. Again, we don't have to actually wait for generations and generations and millions of years to see evolution. We can see evolution for bacteria and for viruses in our lifetime. Okay. All right. I hope that makes sense, guys. If you have any questions, please email me or contact me through Canvas, and then we'll soon see you in the next video.